First of all, I'm not sure what Stan told you about me to get you out here. I'm worried that he told some lies for you to be willing to sit in the cold for at least 5 minutes. Um, but a little bit about my background. I was born here in Orem, actually. Um, and then when I was about 3, our family moved quickly to Arizona. We lived in Mesa for a minute, and then lived in Southern California for about 8 years. And it was while I was in California that I had a really interesting experience. Um, I I don't know what I was expecting out of school. When I went to kindergarten, I think I like finished a puzzle the fastest or something, and like that was a huge deal to the class. And so I was like, oh, I want to be the best at everything that I do here. And so I started to get really like academically competitive, and however you get academically competitive as a kindergartner, whatever that means. Um, but kindergarten and first grade, my identity that I was developing for myself, it was the first time I was like in society, so to speak. And my identity started to get shaped by, oh, that's the kid that finishes his quizzes or his homework the fastest. That's the kid that draws inside of the lines the best or whatever. And I started kind of get full of myself about that. And then in second grade, I got humbled when this girl named Caitlin beat me at everything that we did in second grade. Every single thing that I tried to do, she did it 10 times better without even breaking a sweat. And so as a second grader, I had as much of an identity crisis as a second grader can have. And I started to wonder, what's the point of school? Why am I even here? I can't be the smartest. She reads books faster. She runs faster. I'm like pathetic compared to her. So I needed to figure out, what was I going to get really good at? What was my niche in life going to be if it's not being the best in school? And I decided that uh, I was going to know the gospel as good as I possibly could, that I was going to learn church doctrine as well as I could. I was going to read all of my dad's books on his gospel library shelf. And I thought, well, no one in my class are members of the church, so I can definitely be the best in my class at knowing the position of my church on different topics. Um, so I was listening to, has anyone heard Michael McLean? Okay, so I grew up listening to Michael McLean. He has a song called Will He Ever Come? Has anyone heard that?
Yeah.
I love that song. So as a kindergarten, first, second, third grader, I just listened to this tape. You know how you listen to one side, you flip it, and then you listen to the other side. So I'd listen to the tape while I fell asleep, and I remember every time I got to that song, Will He Ever Come? I would just cry, because it was all about like, will the Savior ever come? Is he ever going to come back and pull us out of this trash that we're in, and help us fix this world that we live in? And as well as my second or third grade mind could comprehend, like I knew that was going to be an incredible day. And so I became really interested in the second coming, last days prophecy. I became really interested in understanding what the church leaders have said about what the future of America looks like and how we get ready for Jesus Christ's return. And so I started going through all of the books that I could find on that, and everything that I was reading was pretty like doom and gloom. If you know what I'm talking about, like it was pretty apocalyptic. A lot of emphasis on like the wars and rumors of wars, the chaos, the destruction, all kinds of parallels to Third Nephi right before Jesus comes, and where nations and cities are just being laid waste like left and right. And so that was what was on my mind as a third grader. And I stopped doing homework because I was like, what's the point? This world's gonna burn. So I spent every recess in detention because I just didn't see a point in school, at least for third grade. I didn't see a point in doing my homework. but I loved reading books on the last days and prophecy and anything about Jesus Christ's return. But these books, the more I read, the more I was just getting really afraid. I was honestly just getting really terrified. And I remember running up to the girl that I liked in 3rd grade, and I said, Kristen, you've got to get baptized. When Jesus comes, the world's going to burn. I don't want you to burn. She didn't get baptized, so I had to rethink my approach. So growing up, I got a little bit more subtle about how I approached people, about my beliefs about the last days, but I definitely chased away some friends because of my very fanatical enthusiasm about the end of the world. I became very good at Boy Scouts because I believed that I was going to have to lash. You guys know what lashing is? It's where you take sticks and tie them together the right way and build a fort. I thought I was going to have to lash a dwelling for my family in the mountains until Jesus Christ came. So I became a really good Boy Scout, learned all the knots, got all the merit badges, not all of them, I wanted to, but not quite. And I lived in fear up until my senior year of high school, when I went to a fireside taught by a brother in our church named Glenn Kimber, and that was my senior year of high school. And he said all this crazy stuff about how the Constitution was going to be restored, that America was going to be healed, that we would basically lay the foundation for the New Jerusalem and, be like this Zion people in preparation for the millennium. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I'm like, I don't know what books you've been reading, but the 4 that I've read definitely don't talk about like the healing of America and the restoration of the Constitution. And so I kind of pushed back. I wasn't really sure what to think of that. I felt the Spirit, so I knew that what he was saying, there was truth to it. I just didn't know. Hey, welcome. I just didn't know how it fit in with everything else I had been learning. I'll share a little bit more about that story later because I know that Stan wants me to talk about the seminars. But feel free to, when we do Q&A after this presentation, feel free to ask more about like my story if that's interesting to you. Actually, a little bit more about me in my senior year. Once I learned about this, I got so fired up about the Constitution, I decided I wanted to withdraw from high school, go into private tutoring, and have Dr. Kimber teach me about the Constitution until college. And then I left on my mission, went to Colorado. So over the past 10 years, so November, what's today? November, 20th. So a couple days ago, 10 years before, was when it was November 10th, 2010 that I met Dr. Kimber and he did that seminar, or that fireside. So it's been 10 years of doing my best to become a scholar in the Constitution so that I can be one of those elders that participates in the movement to restore the Constitution, which I really believe is going to happen. I'll share a little bit about these seminars real quick. Some of you may have seen these before. I know that you guys said you have these. This is what I have been learning to teach out of for the past decade or so. There's an organization started by a man named Cleon Skousen. Cleon Skousen left BYU. He was a professor of religion there for a while. And he started the Freeman Institute. And the Freeman Institute had 4 different divisions that were independent nonprofits. One of them was called the National Center for Constitutional Studies, which you may or may not have heard of. Most of the copies of the 5,000 Year Leap that you get your hands on, it says it's published by NCCS. So what happened was the Freeman Institute started to get confused with the John L. Freeman tax evasion group. I think it was based out of Washington. Someone called Glenn Kimber and said, hey, is your organization the group that's doing the tax evasion, the John L. Freeman group? And he says, I have no idea what you're talking about. Turns out there's a group of people trying to evade taxes by changing, they all legally changed their names to John L. Freeman, and that's how they confused the IRS into not taxing them. So instead, they just got arrested. But the Freeman Institute decided to change its name to the National Center for Constitutional Studies, which was one of those divisions that adopted the name. So that's to answer your question about the Freeman Institute. The National Center for Constitutional Studies / Freeman Institute, they went around teaching what were called the Making of America seminars. There were 6 of them. And the purpose of the seminars was to inspire people with a love of freedom, a love of the Constitution, a knowledge of the Constitution. So they studied American history, the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation, the specific clauses and provisions of the Constitution. And the purpose of the seminars was to get people really fired up and want to return to that. After several years of teaching these seminars, they realized that the seminars didn't have enough of a call to action. It was, let's go get people inspired and fired up, and then the seminars are done and everyone goes home and they're like, well, now what? And so Cleon Skousen, basically on his deathbed, asked Glenn Kimber to redo the seminars. So he took the first 6 seminars on the Making of America and turned them into the first 2 seminars of the Healing of America seminar series. So this first seminar deals with the history leading up to the Revolutionary War. She's adorable. The Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation. So this tells the history leading up to it. This seminar talks about the provisions of the Constitution itself. It talks about how did the political philosophy of the Founding Fathers get applied into a constitutional government. So this takes the principles and the lessons that the founders learned in this and puts them into the Constitution. And then this seminar is it's one of the 2 new seminars. This one talks about how has America been under attack since the Constitution was established. Who are the names of the individuals? What are the organizations? How have they tried to rip apart America? So this tells the story of the unhinging of America. So if you look around and consider all of the political problems that we have today, the goal of this is to trace all of the problems that we have today back to the origins of those, whether it's political or moral or educational attacks, the attacks on the family. So we'll talk about that one today, and then this one talks about, well, what do we do about that? How do we actually restore the Constitution? What does that look like? What does Healing America look like? And so these 2 seminars are the follow-up to what has been taught since the 60s, I think is when the Freeman Institute started. And those seminars were really popular. They taught about 3 million people the Making of America seminars, largely in the 80s, just before Ronald Reagan, and then after his presidency. There's kind of a lull in the seminars when Ronald Reagan became the president, because everyone believed that he was just going to go drain the swamp, make America great again, and that we didn't have to be politically active on the local level because our new constitutional president was going to solve all of our problems at the federal level. And then once Reagan left and basically all of his solutions were reversed, people were like, oh, I guess we do have to be involved citizens and still push for restoring the Constitution. So that created a little bit more demand for the seminars, but like I said, that was before 3 and 4 even were created. Any questions about that so far before we jump into more of the content itself? Okay.
Let's jump.
Okay. So seminar 2 goes through the entire Constitution, including the amendments, And Stan has asked me to cover Seminar 3 in summary and the end of Seminar 2. And I think the end of Seminar 2 is important because it shows how the Constitution itself has come under attack. And like which specific amendments have broken apart major elements of the Constitution itself. One thing I do want to note is that anyone have any guesses how many clauses or provisions or principles are in the Constitution? Just wild guess. I want to see if you guys have a feel for the range of how many. A lot. Close.
100. Hundreds.
Yeah, there's 287 give or take principles, so we're up close to 300. And out of all of those provisions, how many of them do you think have been changed or broken or ignored over the past 150 to 200 years?
287. 200 nobody knows them.
Less than 50.
Less than 50. So
have been ignored.
Yep.
Changed or broken.
Only about 50.
No, that was Dan's guess. That's not what he said.
No, so only about 15% of the Constitution has been changed or ignored. Most of the Constitution is still very intact.
So it's in place.
Most of it.
We just aren't adhering to it.
Some things have definitely been changed. In some ways, the Constitution has absolutely been changed away from the founders' original intent.
And some of the 15% is very vital.
Yeah, the 15% that has been under attack are some of the most important parts of the Constitution, such as the role of the president, the role of the Senate, the role of the courts. So it's a very important 15%, but I'm hearing people talking about we need to just start over. The government's so corrupt, we just need to wipe the slate clean, start over with a new constitution, just give it a clean start. And I think that if we understand that it's only about 15% that's been broken or ignored, that makes it feel a little bit more possible that we can create a movement to turn the other parts around. So the first, actually I'm going to ask you, how many of the amendments to the Constitution do you think were put in place by the Founding Fathers?
The first 10.
12.
The first 12. Anyone? There you go. Anyone know how many articles there are in the Constitution?
So the first 12, was that right?
Yes, first 12.
Is there 24 now or 20? Didn't Pelosi want to make it 25th?
It's like 28.
Close.
29.
27. So there are 27 amendments. How many articles? Close. 7. So not quite 100, but okay. So there are 7 articles in the Constitution, and then 27 amendments, and that's what we're working with here. So most of that's
in an article and an amendment.
So the articles. So for example, the founders wanted to list everything, all of the powers that should be delegated to the legislature, the Congress, House and Senate. So the first article of the Constitution just deals with the legislature. The second article is just kind of a division, it's a chunk of the Constitution. The second article deals with the executive. The third one deals with the Supreme Court, the judiciary, which includes the Supreme Court, absolutely.
Basically, amendments are articles that were added.
Yep, so amendments are, they're usually much smaller than articles. Some amendments are a little long, but generally the amendments are pretty short, and it's just tweaking a little part of the Constitution, adding a provision, taking one out, clarifying something. And the amendment process was intended by the founders in order to improve and perpetuate the principles of the Constitution. So James Madison, he was called the father of the Constitution. He said, happily for America and happily for the whole human race, the founders pursued a more noble course, and that this course is incumbent upon their predecessors, or no, their, what's the opposite of predecessor? It's what comes after. Successors, thank you. It's incumbent upon their successors to improve and perpetuate. So those two words, that's what you want to keep in mind when you're thinking of the purpose of amendments. Amendments should improve the Constitution and perpetuate the original principles. But we're going to look at some amendments that certainly have not perpetuated the original principles, and it's broken the formula. Have you ever been asked if the Constitution is obsolete, or if the Constitution is still relevant today? You ever heard that discussion?
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
It is very relevant, and it is not obsolete,
How come?
because they set up an inspired foundation that people change, but principles don't change. Technology changes,
DMC
but principles
131.
don't change. Human nature.
Okay, say it again. What was that last part you said?
Technology changes, but human nature and principles
Human
don't change.
nature does not change.
Yeah.
So the Constitution was designed based on human nature, which does not change. So as much as technology may change, if technology changes, if society changes, if values change, like if all of these things are fluctuating, the laws should fluctuate to reflect that and to accommodate for that. But the Constitution is different from law. The purpose of a Constitution is to decide what types of laws are even legal, and who's allowed to make those laws, and how those laws can be lawfully made. So the Constitution, I like to describe the Constitution as a circle that we draw around government, and we say, we are hiring you to do these certain number of things, so you're going to stay in this circle. We want you to do a really, really good job in this small circle. Do we want a big government or small government?
Small.
That was a trick question, because as the nation grows, the government is going to need to grow proportionally with that. So government will get bigger and bigger out of necessity, but the better question is, do we want a limited or unlimited government? Does that make sense? So think of it like, we want a government we want to build this fort, we want to build this fortress that the government is going to manage, and we don't want a government that is weak in the areas we have assigned them to be really strong. Do we want a government that has a weak national defense?
We don't want Orem City problem solved on a federal level.
Right.
The problem should be solved on the lowest level that it could possibly be. We don't want the
Right.
state involved with and we don't want the state to
Exactly.
be having the federal government come in and solve problems that the state should solve.
And that's called federalism. So federalism is the word that you want to research when you're looking for how the founders felt about the separation of power across multiple different levels of government: federal, state, local. What's below local? Family, and then individual. So the lowest level of government is self-government, and eventually we want that government to be perfected, because if we can perfect self-government, then we might have a chance at having what's called eternal life, right? So the scope of government is, the proper role of government is articulated in the Constitution, and what happens if the government itself is given the power to change the circle, the size of the circle that it's in.
It will keep taking
Yeah,
until
keep bigger,
it's
bigger,
a border.
bigger.
Yep.
Federalism goes away.
So the government wants job security, and the way you protect job security as government is to make sure there are all kinds of problems and that people believe it's your responsibility to solve them. So government has an incentive to keep pushing that circle wider and wider, and the way that the people had the power to fight against that is to replace who's in the circle through elections. and also knowing history, because has anyone read Animal Farm?
Yes.
You guys are awesome. Very cool. Okay, so what did they write on the barn wall?
The rules.
The
Yeah.
rules.
Like the Constitution.
Yep.
Yeah.
Except what happened to the rules?
Kept
They,
being
they
changed.
adjusted as the pigs needed them to.
Yep, the pigs kept changing the rules, but nobody had a good enough memory to remember exactly what they used to be. And so they knew something was changing, but they couldn't quite put their finger on what.
They were ignorant and illiterate too, and that was the big problem. And I feel like that's what's happened to so much. I mean, there's so much ignorance, and like illiteracy today, as far as not even knowing how to read, like the Constitution, and have it make sense to them. Like older writings, we're
And the
so,
style. We're
Yeah,
losing
we're
the
just-
ability to read cursive.
Yeah, and so it's just, I mean, I saw one interview where he was on a college campus asking if socialism was good. She's like, yeah, it could be good or it could be bad. We're socializing right now. I was like, oh my gosh. Like, but that is how ignorant we are, where we think that if socialism is socializing, then a lot of people think, oh, that's good. Just, it
Yep.
blows my mind.
Which perfectly leads us into, we're going to start in Seminar 3, and I'm going to refer back to Seminar 2 a couple times, but Seminar 3 starts with the attack on the founder's educational dream. So each seminar is broken into 4 sessions, and the first one talks about the 2 cycles of education in America. But before we get into the first cycle, we need to talk about the founder's intention for education. Now, keep in mind, they were coming up with a government that was going to require people's regular participation. A government made by we the people needs to also be maintained and supervised by we the people. And if we're not really educated, then the rules might be changing on the barn, and if we don't know our history, if we don't know rhetoric, if we don't know language arts, like if we don't understand exactly what the rules are saying and recognize small changes, we're not prepared to revert back to how things were supposed to be. Has everyone here heard of a man named Ezra Taft Benson?
Yeah.
Okay. In a talk, I believe this one was from, oh gosh, which one was this? It'll come to me. In one of his talks, he said, are the elders of Israel who have been tasked with restoring the Constitution, are they studying the Constitution? Do we know the Constitution well enough to recognize when it's under attack? What he's saying is, do we know the rules on the barn well enough to recognize when the rule has been changed a little bit, when the pigs are in there and trying to shake things up? And so let's talk about the importance of education. The founders emphasized that the key to the survival of the American success formula was universal education. So they wanted a very public education where everybody had access to important education that was going to prepare them for effective and meaningful citizenship. Unfortunately today, our school systems are no longer public. As Dr. Kimber recently said, he said the schools have gone from public school to government school. It used to be that the community dictated what the curriculum was going to be, how much funding the schools needed, who the teachers were going to be, how teachers were qualified, how student success was measured. The parents and the communities were the ones that articulated that. And so that was public school. Now we have government school, where government gets to set the standards, and it's a very top-down, national to local approach to the education system. So when we talk about universal education, I just want you to keep in mind that public school and government school are 2 kind of different concepts in the founders' eyes. Does that make sense? Okay, the founders knew that they had made a tremendous breakthrough in human progress by setting up the first free people in modern times. They also knew that this great blessing could be lost unless Americans were educated from generation to generation. They viewed education as a national security concern. The nation could not be secure with an uneducated, emotionally charged electorate. What's the problem with a democracy?
It's mob rule
Mob rule. Why is the mob dangerous?
because they're emotionally charged and they feed on each other and
Mm-hmm.
it's chaos.
There you go.
Seattle, Portland,
Yep.
Wisconsin.
Because no one will
Exactly.
listen to anything anyone else says. There's a lot of people who agree with you on this one.
Sometimes problems are created through really complicated decisions that have been made by lots of different people, and when you're angry about a problem, there's usually not just one person who's the person to blame, and it takes time to understand issues. And so decisions needed to be made a little bit away from the people so that they could be made with wisdom and foresight and knowledge and understanding, expertise, not just through the emotional demands of a short-term focused people. The founders believed two things about human nature. The founders believed that human nature was a mix of good and bad. They believed that our human physical carnal desires were imperfect and corruptible, but they also believed in the perfectibility of human reason. So they believed that it was possible for the democracy of the people to choose a representative and transform the government from a democracy into a republic that was capable of making decisions with a long-term perspective, but also addressing short-term needs at the same time. We'll reference this again in a moment, but just keep in mind that the House of Representatives was specifically designed by the founders to address the short-term demands of the people. When people are emotionally charged, they're going to go to the representatives that they get to vote for directly and tell them exactly how they feel. And you want the House of Representatives to be responsive to those emotional needs. But the Senate was designed to be further separated from the people, removed from the need to campaign and focus on the kind of the showiness of elections. They wanted the senators to be above the normal campaigning and the slander that goes along with that, the mudslinging. And that's one of the things that has been broken, but we'll talk about that in just a little bit. At that time, the founders' time, the idea of universal education was entirely unique. For example, when John Adams visited France, he was shocked to learn that out of 24 million Frenchmen, only about 500,000 could read or write. 24 million Frenchmen, only 500,000 could read or write. That means that you've got almost 50, a 1 to 24, a 1 to 50 ratio. Out of every 50 people, you have about one person that can read or write. And so the founders rejected the European idea that there should only be an elite, educated upper class. Speaking on the need for universal education, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "No other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness. Preach a crusade against ignorance. Establish and improve the law for educating the common people." So the first cycle of education in America was very focused on it was very driven by parents. Parents, especially mothers, were very involved with the classroom, with choosing teachers, choosing curriculum, prioritizing the subjects, when kids were going to learn what materials, and the kids generally learned all in one large group. Kids of all ages would go learn together, and the siblings would learn with each other, and some siblings couldn't quite keep up, and they leaned on the other siblings for help. And so it became a family, education was a family matter. siblings studied together, they attended school together. They would come home. Mom didn't have to ask, well, what did you learn at school? Because mom chose the curriculum and worked with the teacher closely. So the schools were much smaller, and the education was focused on the basics. So basic math, basic reading and literacy, basic geography, science, political science. They focused on the things that they believed would help kids become good citizens, not good employees, not good in the workforce. They were focused on the citizenship and the family aspect of education. So if the founders were to come to our schools today and see schools that, like primary schools that are putting really heavy emphasis on sports, really heavy emphasis on things like robotics or other more career-focused programs, that would have confused them because they wouldn't see where the relationship was between taxpayer-funded public schools raising a generation of citizens that are actually just putting them through sports and career-specific education. Do you see the difference between those two paradigms for school? The schools largely used books published by William McGuffey called the McGuffey Readers. Has anyone heard of those? Okay, so they found that most of the kids coming to school had already learned to read before coming to school because they were reading the Bible at home with their families. So this was to take them to the next step. Let's skip through a little bit.
One other important part about that too is that the older siblings were there to make sure that the younger siblings were hearing the correct principles.
Yep, that's a great point.
That's why they all met together.
There are schools who have that have been started in recent years that combine all of the kids back into class, like one large class. Sometimes they do it like there's a junior A, junior B, and a senior class. So there's like the nursery age group, and then there's the more elementary age group, and then the kind of junior high through high school age group. And so it's in 3 classes because you're not going to teach trigonometry to a nursery kid. That just doesn't make sense. But when you keep them in relatively large groups with multiple age ranges, the older siblings won't let the younger kids get picked on or bullied. They're not going to let the younger kids get caught up in doing bad things because they're protective of their younger siblings. But the younger kids are going to tattle on the older siblings if they see them doing anything wrong. And so there were some schools, I think in Missouri or Mississippi, that tried this out, and they found that bullying, drugs, harassment, like all of the things that make school dangerous and really kind of a degrading environment, those things evaporated once all of the kids were brought together into multi-age groups where siblings are sitting in the same classrooms again.
They have a lot of actually charter schools around here. My kids grew up going
Do they do that?
to charter schools where they go twice a week,
Mm-hmm.
and then they were separated just like the age groups of junior primary and senior primary.
Yep.
And so they grew up in school together, and they did I can just say that is exactly how it happened. And I mean, I think it did a lot. It really helped them look out for each other. They grew closer together, and it was awesome. And it was just enough, just twice a week, enough for them to get out and to do a little bit of schooling and everything. But their schooling wasn't focused. It was focused on just the basics, like you say. And there's a lot of charter schools out there like that. And my sister-in-law has 8 kids. Most of them are grown, but her younger 2, this year, she decided to pull out and do homeschool. And she said, why didn't I do this years ago? She said it has actually been better in so many ways, and she's just kind of kicking herself for not doing it with her older ones that are all moved out and married and everything now. And she's got these younger two. They're Kaylee and Amelia's age, and that she's homeschooling and she loves it.
Yeah.
And it was just this year because of COVID that kind of gave her the courage to jump into that, because she was already doing some things from home. She's like, wait a minute, what if I started choosing some of my own curriculum? Who says I have to do their curriculum? So she just ordered some books and just does basics, math, reading, writing, and then lets them explore the rest of them.
Exactly. So the early school, the first cycle focused on get kids excited about learning, teach them how to learn, teach them where to study, teach them how to use the resources that are available, get them really wound up, and then let them go. And you could never teach them as fast as they can teach themselves.
Oh yeah.
And the second cycle has turned into more of a conveyor belt factory type of model for producing kids as like educated. Cookie
Well, I
cutter
feel like
education.
it's from the bottom up that they've gone backwards. So they try to cram all this stuff in them and then say, now go be inspired and find out what you want to do. And they're so burned out from it, and it's become so dull and boring through a lot of they make it so dull and boring. But then if instead you find out what inspires them and what they love, and then let them,
You gotta get out of the way because they'll run you over.
oh yeah, then you've got to supply them with things that will help them grow in that, but they will do anything for their own passion.
Here's an example of that. My brother Jared, my mom was homeschooling him and several of my other siblings. I'm the oldest of 7. My family's primarily in Arizona, and my brother really was not interested in learning math. He hated math, and my mom did not have the energy to fight him. He is, if there's a libertarian in my family, it's him. He is very just independent-minded. He does not want to be told anything about what he should do, and my mom just didn't have the energy to fight him anymore. So she let him just spend years playing computer games. She just didn't have the energy for that fight anymore. And so he grows up, he's like in his, I think mid junior high years, upper junior high, pushing high school, and he still hasn't done fractions and decimals yet. And there comes a point where he decides he wants to start building his own computer games. And so he asked, I think he asked my mom if he could get a programming tutor. So this tutor started teaching him Python and some other coding languages, and he got to a point where he realized he needed to know calculus in order to replicate gravity in a computer game. He's like, well, what do I need to know calculus? Like, I just got to hurry and get this out of the way. I got to build my game. So he learned that he needed to learn fractions and decimals, and then algebra, and then pre-calc, and go through some of these different courses. And he blew through those so fast. I think he did Khan Academy. He just blew through them because he wanted to hurry and build his game. And then he became so good at calculus that once he got put back into the schools, he was tutoring his grade on calculus because no one else knew it better than him. And he was just, he went from knowing almost no math to knowing calculus in maybe a year and a half or so, because now he had a reason to learn. And I think the first cycle of education, they focused on the why a lot better. So for example, in the late 1700s, when our country was experiencing the first fruits of freedom, under the laws of its new constitution, Noah Webster said, all government originates in families, and if neglected there, it will hardly exist in society. The foundation of all free government and all social order must be laid in families and in the discipline of youth. The education of youth is an employment of more consequence than making laws and preaching the gospel, because it lays the foundation on which both the law and the gospel rest for success. And they passed what was called the Northwest Ordinance. You guys heard of that? Northwest Ordinance said any territory wanting to become a state in the United States needs to have universal education, needs to have these public schools, and they need to teach religion, morality, and knowledge. And those were the three things that the schools had to teach to satisfy the requirements for public education as a new state. Notice though that knowledge was the third out of the three that they focused on. The first was religion, and then morality and knowledge. So they put emphasis on the need to have a moral strength as a society. Self-government is only possible in a society that self-governs through moral discipline. And George Washington and others believed that you couldn't depend on people to be moral without emphasizing religion. And so religion and morality were the first two priorities, and those go closely hand in hand. And then knowledge, the more kind of tangible knowledge, like the math and stuff like that, that was the third consideration. And they did an excellent job at implementing this. Let's see. Clearly, early Americans wanted their children to learn not only the academics of reading and writing, but also the principles of living God's commandments. Clinton Rossiter said that colonial education's chief purpose was to support revealed religion. That was the primary purpose of the schools. And amazingly, even though the schools focused less on the sciences and the math and everything that we are pushing so hard today, the STEM subjects, the students back then were better at the STEM subjects than we are today because they had a reason to learn it. They believed that the purpose of schools was to learn how to serve God, family, and country. Benjamin Franklin said that learning to serve God, family, and country should be the aim and end of all true learning. And unfortunately, that has been under attack. I'm going to skip a little bit of the material on the first cycle and just jump into the second. So, has anyone here heard of Horace Mann? Mm-hmm. Okay, so Horace Mann was a humanist. He believed in the philosophies of people like Plato and some of the others that believed that schools were to be secular, that they were to be used for developing this irreligious utopia. So he says that children should no longer be held responsible for their natural instincts of behavior, that they should be all behavior should be looked at as innately good. Children should be given the freedom to experiment, to live however they want, find out for themselves what makes them happy, and moral relativism. They believed an elite educational establishment was to save our society through their manipulated opinions of how education should be administered, that mankind was to be the measure of all things, not God, and that children were now to be taught that there are no absolute values of right and wrong, and that one's decisions are always based in particular situations at the time, not on absolutes. He said, "What the church has been for medieval man, the public school must become for the democratic and rational man. God will be replaced by the concept of the public good. The common schools shall create a more far-seeing intelligence and a purer morality than has ever existed among communities of men." So within humanism, the belief is that any rules imposed by parents on children or imposed by churches, any types of these moral rules or behavioral rules are infringing on the children's freedom, and that freedom is what matters most. Freedom to do whatever we want in virtually any situation, that should be protected absolutely. And so it caught on because, we're a freedom-loving people. We love this idea of live and let live, let other people choose their own lifestyle and their own behavioral standards. And so it started to catch on, at least culturally, but his educational philosophies didn't take root in the schools until John Dewey. So John Dewey comes along, and
But
Yeah,
we're
go ahead.
talking about the destruction, right?
yep, we're now in
Okay.
the second.
Not the same Dewey with the Dewey Decimal
Well, I know, but
System.
he was just talking about like, oh, children should be able to do whatever they want, whenever they want, should never be held accountable.
Yeah, so this is
I'm not sure
definitely
how
the
much-
second cycle of
Okay.
education. So
We're
the
all cleared
first, does anyone want to make a guess when the first cycle ended and the second cycle began?
First was around the 1800s, late 1800s.
Okay, what was your guess?
Said 1820.
That is really close. It's the 1830s. Yep.
Preach the gospel.
Yep. What else was going on in the 1830s? Yeah, so there you've got the Second Great Awakening.
Restoration.
So the church was restored 1830, and once God set up his program, Satan immediately comes in with his counterfeit. You've also got a guy named Karl Marx across the water, and he's preaching Marxism. So we'll get into him in a second.
Preaching Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically John Dewey comes along and he says that the type of educational philosophy that Horace Mann had, he wanted to actually implement in the educational system. So John Dewey worked with Columbia University's Teachers College. He became really good friends with the administrators there, and he essentially developed a program, a curriculum for teaching teachers how to teach Horace Mann's secular humanism philosophy. So Horace Mann's dreams came true when John Dewey worked with Columbia to develop these administrators for all of these schools. And I think something like 50 years later, I think it was in the around 1853, 1/3 of all of the deans and presidents of teachers colleges across the country were graduates of John Dewey's program at Columbia. So within a very short time, they had taken this model for the schools and had disseminated it across a large chunk of the country. Now, he recognized that the largest obstacle to moral relativism and secular humanism was families and religion. Yep. So what he did was he said the youth need to be separated so that the kids are attending based on their age group. So kids go to school with their peers, and not their siblings, and they're not even going to see most of their siblings because not only are they split up into separate grades, they're sent to completely different schools where they only see their siblings at the end of the day when they're packed with homework. His goal is to fill the day with school, whereas school normally was just a couple of days out of the week, a few hours a day. It didn't dominate the kids' schedules. So he wanted to fill their time with the school, fill their evenings with extracurricular activities and homework, and he said if we can keep them that busy, then the influence of parents and the Christian church can be broken within about a generation. Because when you're struggling to understand this curriculum that the government chose instead of your parents, who are you going to lean on for help? Not your siblings and not your parents, but your classmates and your teacher. And if your teacher teaches you something and they're the expert and it goes against what your parents said, who's right? Well, in his model, it's the teacher, because the parents were the uneducated obstacles in his perspective. So in the first cycle of education, kids are going to school. They're being taught the same thing at school that they're being taught at home. It creates a testimony of multiple witnesses kind of experience. But now they're hearing different things at home, different things at school, but they're spending 5 to 6 times more time with their teacher than they are their parents. They know a lot of their teachers better than they know their parents because their parents hardly see them with as much homework as they have. So this educational I won't call it a revival, I would say this revolution, this educational revolution, really started to pick up in the 60s and 70s. But an interesting thing was happening over the past 140 or so years of American history. So anyone remember what happened in the late 1800s politically?
After the Civil War,
Uh-huh.
the rebuilding,
Okay, so what happened during the Reconstruction era? Have you guys heard of the populist and progressive movements? So the populist movement put a lot of emphasis on power to the people, let the people choose all of their representatives. We don't want senators to be elected by legislatures. We want them to be elected by the people. People should have control over every aspect of their government. So that was like an emphasis on we the people, which sounds good, but it pulled us really far towards democracy, away from the republic element of wise representation.
So it's out of balance.
It totally pulled it out of
States'
balance.
rights away from them.
Yeah, so when the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913, it definitely took away states' rights. But the groundwork for getting rid of the 17th Amendment was being laid by the populist movement in the late 1800s. Has anyone heard of the progressive movement? Okay, so the progressive movement was more of the conservative side of that Reconstruction era. The populist movement was more of the liberal side. The progressive era was more of the conservative side. Pretty much everyone in America was pushing for, because their education has been changing, they've stopped learning so much about the original intent for the Constitution, how that balance was supposed to work. They have a little bit less confidence in that. Their education was kind of strange during the Civil War because everyone was distracted. So changes are being made to education thanks to influences like Marx and others, that people are distracted. So during the progressive era, people were saying that the federal government should be more actively involved in solving our problems. Now, typically, the progressives they leaned more to the right than the populists, but both of them were trying to use the federal government to solve local problems. So whether you are populist or progressive, both sides are saying bigger government. And that's kind of where we're at today, is Democrats want the president to get really involved in our lives and do Democrat things. Many Republicans want the Republican president to be very involved in doing very Republican things, and very few people are talking about, well, actually the president shouldn't be this important. Actually, the president should almost have no agenda because they're not even the lawmaking branch of our government. We should be talking about the congressional agenda, not the president's agenda. And so the foundation of where we're at today with our attitude towards the president goes back more than 100 years. We come into the early 1900s, and the education system really starts to come under attack. This is even before John Dewey. Specifically talking about the curriculum. So in the 1950s, there was a congressional investigation done in the Senate where they wanted to understand how American education has changed. 1950s come around, and the Senate is really concerned about the how deeply entrenched socialist and just strong government attitudes, how deeply entrenched they're becoming in the schools and within the children. they're like, where is this coming from? Like this change has been too fast. It's happened during our lifetimes. It's happened too fast for it to be accidental. Where are the schools? Like, how have the schools changed so much? So this Senate investigation conducted by Senator Reese, well, he called for it, and then Norman Dodd was the lead researcher in this, and he went to the tax-exempt foundations. He noticed that the schools were largely being directed by the federal government. The federal government was largely being directed by the Carnegie Endowment and the Rockefeller Foundation and a couple other foundations. And so they wanted to know, well, what have these foundations been up to? Are these the groups that are leading the schools off track? And so they did an investigation. They subpoenaed the foundations and read all of their memos, the minutes from their directors' meetings, and they found that more than $1.25 billion had been spent to re-educate the educators. So what happened was these foundations, people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and others, some of the most powerful people in the country, they realized that if they wanted to succeed in their goal of really dominating like global politics, not just United States politics, if they wanted to have international monopolies, not just American monopolies, this needed to be a one world government. We need to get rid of national sovereignty. We need to kind of make borders a little fuzzy and globalize everything. And so their goal was to gain as much personal wealth as they could by pushing for globalism. Problem was the schools were all teaching, yay America, we love the Constitution, and we would never be loyal to anything else. Very pro founding fathers. And so what they did was they went to the historians and said, would you be willing to rewrite the history books and do a more anti-founding fathers message? Asked them if they would be willing to change the education so that it was treated like, we're now past the Industrial Revolution, we're now in the Reconstruction era, the Constitution is obsolete. It was made for an agrarian farmer community that was a long time ago and it's not relevant today. And the historians wouldn't do it. Even some of the most prominent and pretty liberal historians like Charles and Mary Beard, they wouldn't even do it. So these foundations decided, well, then we need to raise our own generation of historians. And what they did was they put together a scholarship and said, we're going to choose the rising stars, the upcoming historians that are showing a lot of potential. We'll put them on a scholarship, send them over to England where they will learn the truth about the founding fathers, right? Because England loves the American founding fathers, post-Revolutionary War and everything. So we started sending rising historians over to England to learn about the truth of American history. And so they come back and they're being propped up as the best trained, most educated, most diversified historians this country's ever seen. And so they start influencing the curriculum that's being written and the messaging that's coming from the government. They are the ones being put into government, national education positions, telling local schools how to feel about the founding fathers and the Constitution with the most up-to-date research. One of their most effective ways of changing people's attitudes about the founding fathers was they created a bunch of lies and rumors about the founding fathers being immoral, having all kinds of illegitimate children, affairs, that they were unfaithful, that they were actually really selfish and greedy, and having all this new research not based in historical reality to support that as evidence. So once people started to get turned off to the founders because, they're not as great as we thought they were, then they were willing to abandon their loyalty to the Constitution itself. Have you ever heard of someone attacking a message by attacking the person instead of the book? You ever heard of people attacking Joseph Smith because they couldn't attack the Book of Mormon itself? It's called the ad hominem argument, and it's where you attack the character of the character of the person who represents the message instead of having to deal with the message itself. So they were really effective at this. They convinced America to, or at least convinced the teachers to teach this. The parents didn't really know exactly what was going on because they're distracted by World War I in the mid-1910s, and then they're distracted by the prosperity of the Roaring '20s. Then they're distracted by the Great Depression in the '30s. Then they're distracted by World War II in the '40s. And the '50s come around, and all of these decades of distractions have allowed these corrupt educators and these secret combinations to change our curriculum. And so this researcher, Norman Dodd, the material that they found on who has been behind the educational changes and what their goals were and how they've done it, it was so eye-opening that one of his assistant researchers actually had to be institutionalized. She lost her mind and went insane because she was just like so traumatized by what she learned. And that research was, the White House ordered that it be destroyed immediately before it was even taken to the general body of the Senate. So Norman Dodd had only brought it to the Senate committee that was investigating it, and the White House said, destroy all copies of this research. So Norman Dodd obeyed them and just made a copy and then destroyed that copy and then went to the White House and honestly told them every copy of that research has been destroyed, and sent the original research, boxes and boxes of this material, to a man named Glenn Kimber and Cleon Skousen. So they spent many years studying.
Who was the president?
Eisenhower at the time. Yep.
How do you say his name?
my.
Dodd?
Norman Dodd, D-O-D-D.
And that was about the time President Benson was writing his patriotic books.
Yep. That's around the time that David O. McKay was warning us about the infiltration of communism in America. So that's when we started to get really politically charged as a body of
So how was
Latter-day
he
Saints.
connected with Brother Scouts and then the Kimber?
Norman Dodd.
Mhm.
So at the time, so he didn't send that research in the 50s. He sent that research 1 or 2 decades later,
Oh.
once the Freeman Institute / NCCS became really prominent.
So he just kind of held on to it.
He didn't know who to go to. He's like, the White House ordered me to destroy it. I
Was he
couldn't.
LDS?
No.
Or
No,
he
but-
just knew that these LDS brethren
Well,
could be trusted?
the Freeman Institute, the Freeman Institute was the very first constitutional studies organization in the country. I mean, there wasn't like constitutional studies nonprofits in every state like there are today.
I read the Cleon's stuff in Congress
Mhm.
about communism
Yep.
coming to America and all that kind
Yep.
of stuff.
The 45
Yeah, the 45
communist
things.
objectives. Yep.
Of course, we know it was just coincidental.
Yeah, exactly. So that research made it into the hands of Glenn Kimber. Glenn Kimber had the fortune of marrying Cleon Skousen's oldest daughter, and they worked together for 35 plus years.
Oh my gosh.
So we acquired that research. We also found research about the Soviet attack on the American moral fiber. So the Soviet Union learned that they realized that they were not going to be able to militarily defeat the United States. And so they changed their approach. They decided, instead of trying to do like a military or revolutionary overthrow of America, they were going to evolutionarily overthrow our country culturally.
So in 1963, Khrushchev's pounding his shoe on the pulpit saying, we'll destroy your generation of your youth.
Exactly,
And
and
that was their plan.
There's-
Benson. Sorry, go ahead.
No, there's actually, my son showed me, it's actually kind of freaky. It's a new Call of Duty, but it's based on Black Ops or whatever, and it's on the Cold War, but it shows the Russian leaders telling about how they were going to
Oh wow.
attack America by dividing America, by
Yep.
by tearing down morality and all these
Mhm.
different things, and it's freaky actually.
Well,
But
and,
it's a Call of Duty game, but
but they knew their history. The developers understand how the Soviets tried to infiltrate America, and arguably each of those 45 goals has been accomplished. They
it's
just
like
want
Hydra
to.
almost. I mean, it's
Mhm.
really weird to see this stuff happening in movies and stuff. And it's weird to have people almost say, "Oh, you're a conspiratorialist," or just the fact that you think that the government's not out to get you. And I think you have no idea how long this has been happening.
Mhm.
I mean, this has been almost from America's birth.
I mean,
Um,
that right there might be the reason why it is in movies.
Yeah.
yeah,
To kind of desensitize us of it, like, oh yeah, that's just the movies.
that's just movies.
And it's like kind of reality
Yeah.
because like they also want to take us down through the media, like through cinema is kind of what they said, right? Where it's like, yeah, we'll like infiltrate sex and violence and all that stuff in the movies. But-
One of Cleon Skousen's tasks that he was given while working for the FBI was to go clean up Hollywood and get the communist agenda infiltration out of Hollywood. So he was working with J. Edgar Hoover. He worked for the FBI for something like 16 years. Yeah, so he was sent to the FBI building just outside of UCLA in California, and he was told, go find the communists in Hollywood, teach them the truth and convert them, or let's get them out of there. And so he went in and became really good friends with people like Walt Disney, with Walter Knott of Knott's Berry Farm, Cecil B. DeMille, who made the Ten Commandments movie. They also worked with Art Linkletter. Do you guys remember Kids Say the Darndest Things?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So Art Linkletter. I think John Wayne was part of their friend group. Anyways, so Cleon Skousen was actually, he got his bachelor's in theater. So he wanted to be an actor. He was raised in California. That's where he went to college. It was in San Bernardino, I believe, where he was the student body president. And his goal was to be an actor, which is possibly why J. Edgar Hoover sent Cleon back to Hollywood. He said, that's your stomping grounds. Like, that's where you're from. You know acting. You can relate with these people really well. You're one of our best educators, because he had been traveling around teaching pro-America, anti-communism seminars for the FBI for several years. And so he went and met a guy named Ronald Reagan, who was a Democrat, and
Oh my gosh.
worked on him. And Cleon Skousen and a couple other people eventually taught Ronald Reagan the truth about America and the founding fathers and the Constitution, and helped him become a conservative.
Maybe Chris Pratt will be the next president.
Candace Owens might be running. That'd be
Yeah, she's flirting with that idea.
I honestly can see, with the way technology has come today, that Hollywood will be purged all on its own through seeing things like what's happened with VidAngel and The Chosen, this series, that we have a new venue of providing
Yeah.
the kind of acting, the kind of movies, the kind of shows and things like that. And I actually feel like people underestimate, and not only that, YouTube itself, we have stars, I guess you could say, where the people have chosen them to be their stars, even
Right.
though they may not be deemed by Hollywood to be important, and might even be easily censored through YouTube. But
We
I
no longer
think
have to go
they
through Hollywood.
underestimate the influence that these people already have, and that they're actually more influential than Hollywood. I see today a big movement of people turning away from Hollywood.
And their best effort to keep us away from good entertainment is to keep us distracted, to get us caught up in devices, to get us addicted to social media, just distract us as much as possible. In the notes, in the memos, the board meeting minutes, for groups like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Rockefeller Foundation, they were asking themselves the question, what is the most effective way of changing the culture of a people as fast as possible? Is there any way faster than war of changing the general culture of an entire nation? And after some research and debate, they came back together and said, no, war is the most effective way of changing the culture of entire people.
1984.
Yeah, and this was well before 1984. This was pre-World War I.
Like the book, 1984.
Yeah, George Orwell, I know what you're referring to. And I don't remember when he wrote that one, though.
Wasn't that
It was a while ago. Anyway.
Yeah. So in the early 1910s, before World War I, these extremely powerful people, just to give you a sense of how powerful John D. Rockefeller was, anyone know what his wealth would be measured at in today's dollars? Close. It was about, I think he was about $600 billion.
kind of like Bill Gates today? I don't know.
Bill Gates is, I think he's
His
only in
family's
like
the
the,
richest in the world.
just
Bill
how
Gates'
they
family?
use
No,
wealthy people.
Oh, Rockefellers? yeah. So it gets a little
Well, they're
bit,
kind of like hidden in the back. They don't really want to be known as that.
Yep.
So Rockefellers and Rothschilds and controlled the
Right.
world before
Carnegie
our
Right.
country
and
was
his family
established.
and JP Morgan.
So
and all of that.
these families were extremely powerful in the early 1900s, and they said, okay, we're going to have to resort to war to change the culture because that is the most effective way. So we actually have record of them urging Woodrow Wilson to not end World War I too fast.
Oh my God.
They wanted to stretch it on as long as possible. There's even some evidence that leads many people to believe that they actually helped initiate World War I to create a distraction, to create an emergency that would help lead to that chaos.
I'm probably one of those people that needs a great deal of education.
Yeah.
Because I tend to despair a little bit more. So in what I hear nearly 200 years of this being embedded into the system. Like I said, almost before it even started.
Mhm.
We had people embedding this stuff into the system so that people don't know any different nowadays. It's just it's a part. If they've succeeded, it feels like part of the system, right? I assume. I don't really know what I'm trying to say, and I don't really know what question to ask. My question is, what do you do against a system, a body, an ideology that has been so entrenched? Because I assume people have been teaching the Constitution. I mean, parents were just by nature teaching the greatness of America. So then you had this group of people that we got to rethink. So we're going to send these educators to England to kind of start, shifting things away from that. So I know I don't have as much knowledge as a lot of people. You have a lot more knowledge than I do in this particular regard, right? But I trust that this is what's happening. This is what I'm saying. I hands down, it's as clear as day. Glenn Beck the other day said you'd have to be dead not to see this stuff, and I agree with him. You got to be dead not to see that people are actively trying to destroy this country and everything that it has ever stood for, and on all the good that it has done throughout the globe, not just for the people here. So there you go. I don't.
So what do you
Yeah.
basically? What do you do? Where do we go from here?
Where's the hope?
Well, and you-
Where's the hope?
Well, you have a great answer for that, don't you?
So
Well, it's because that's why
sorry,
you're
Sam.
smiling like that. You're like,
Yeah.
I've heard this before. I know what the answer is.
Well,
many people
I
are
s-
hopeless.
I started as absolutely depressed, and I didn't even know like the good news. Like I felt this way, like what you're describing, that was me as a third grader up until senior year. I didn't know what a GPA was my senior year because what did it matter? Colleges aren't even going to exist. The world's going to fall apart. Like I thoroughly expected colleges to not even exist by the time I got off my mission. So I wasn't preparing for college. I didn't prepare for a career until after my mission because I didn't think there was any hope. Thankfully, there is. I am so amazed by the Constitution. It has been so strong, and our moral fiber as a people have been so strong that in almost 200 years of attacks on the American system, education, the Constitution itself, they've only destroyed about 15%. That's got to say some good things about how deeply entrenched the importance of religion, the importance of faith and Christianity, like how that has been entrenched for so long until a little bit more recently. Yeah.
So I believe personally, and I try to be an optimist. So I really think until somebody proves me different, we've got to believe that there's more with us than without us.
Right.
Oh, that sounds like my lesson.
Yes. And you know what I should have said in that, because we were talking in our
Religious
society lesson
Yeah.
about they that be with us are more than they that be with
Yeah,
them.
Elisha.
And I was talking about, I sometimes feel engulfed and surrounded, like in Revelations, when the dragon opens his mouth to flood out the woman who's getting ready to give birth to Zion, right? And when the dragon opens his mouth, when Satan opens his mouth, what comes out? It's lies. And if that's what's flooding the earth, that is what's flooding the earth to destroy Zion. But I should have mentioned this in it. What happens next is the earth cracks open and swallows up the flood. And she's saved. She's preserved. Well, when did the earth burst open with something that would swallow up lies? It has to be truth. When did the earth burst open with truth that would swallow up the lies? And it is the Book of Mormon. But I just feel like this book is so amazing for swallowing the lies of and exposing secret combinations in such a way that I think there will be a lot of people who will their eyes will be opened because of the Book of Mormon, and it will clear away the lies so clearly that he has no power over those who are seeking after truth.
Truth and light.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's amazing to me that at this time where our country is so crazy and divided and whatever the word is, that's what we're so much. That there's never been a time where there's been more missionaries in the U.S. preaching the gospel and preaching the Book of Mormon because missionaries have been called home from around the world because of COVID. And most of them have been reassigned in the country, and we have a phenomenal amount of young men and young women trying to raise the religious
And they're being successful, and we don't hear about it.
of our country to help protect it. What are you waving at me for? What, talking?
Yeah, let's get back on track.
Did you have a thought or comment?
No, if you got one.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, that's funny.
You're good. So, there's two ways that you can try to heal America. We've been trying one of them, and it's not working. That's called the shotgun approach. The shotgun approach is where you make a list of all of the problems that you want to see get solved, and you go create 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 organizations to try to solve each of those individual problems. We've been doing that for a very long time, and that's slowed down the decay, but it has not reversed hardly anything. The other way is what President Benson calls the rifle approach, and the rifle approach is where you list all of those problems, and then you categorize them. And once you've got the problems into groups, then you ask what happened to allow this category of problems to even exist. What happened to the family unit, to the education system, to the political system? What happened to the Constitution specifically that allowed those groups of problems to exist? Focus your energy on the Constitution, fix that really quickly. So I've been in the liberty movement for several years, and I've been trained by some of the largest conservative organizations in the country on how to fundraise. And as I've been learning with some of these organizations, I've learned about what their budgets are and how much money is being pumped into the liberty movement in the United States and in other countries. And it's in the many, many hundreds of millions of dollars each year, if not more than $1 billion a year, just into the liberty movement in America. And do we see any lasting change happening? It's because we're doing the shotgun approach. If we took a fraction of those resources and put them into here's how to restore the Constitution itself, instead of just finding all of the laws, because what we're trying to do is that circle that represents the proper role of the government has gone from, let's say, this to this, and it's got holes in it. And what the people are trying to do right now is fix problems within that circle. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We're trying to change laws inside of this circle, but we have legitimately allowed the government to take on that size of responsibilities. And until we shrink the circle, we'll never be able to solve all of the problems inside of it. Is that making sense?
So to find the one that is the most important to aim at first, would that be like the brokenness of the family?
The family is actually under attack effectively because of either the lack of laws dealing with like decency and morality, or because of the educational system and how the education system has gotten in between parents and kids. And so that goes back to politics. Most of the education and family and like moral issues actually tie back to something happened to the Constitution and the proper role of government itself. So you got a thought, and then I'll come back to that comment.
What are some of the things you have to do, some of the efforts you have to put forth to actually affect that?
So what we're working on right now is we have noticed that it takes a really long time to turn someone into a constitutional scholar. There aren't very many. Kind of feels like the lone Jedis, that there's just like a couple left. Like we're trying to speed up the process that someone goes through to become an effective advocate of all of the principles of liberty and the Constitution from the viewpoint of the founders. So there are 4 different types of organizations or activities in the liberty movement. So one is the popularizer, which is what most people think of when they think of restore the Constitution. Popularizers are the individuals and the organizations that make certain political perspectives popular. Think Candace Owens, Charlie Kirk, Steven Crowder, who does the Change My Mind booths and his podcast. You've got Will Witt, Prager University, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson.
AOC.
Yeah, AOC on the opposite side. Absolutely.
I think we should have watched them.
So she and Bernie Sanders have been popularizers for the left.
Yeah.
So the conservatives have a lot of popularizers, and they're pretty well known. They aren't pushing for actually restoring the Constitution. So we either have to influence the popularizers with a better message, or we have to create new popularizers to champion that message.
How would you do that if the media censors all of these these people who are trying to do that?
I'm not concerned about the platform side. So I'm not concerned about the platform side. Most of the time that media is censoring people, it's because the people are talking about very divisive Republican versus Democrat and like cultural issues today. virtually no one that's talking about federalism and specific ways to restore the Constitution and pull back the power of the Supreme Court. No, none of those people are being censored because that message is boring to people and they're not making a big ripple. I'm not concerned about the platform side of this because it is so easy to start a new social media platform today that I think there will always be a platform that reaches enough people for that message to become popular if the message is good enough. So that's the popularizers. Do you have another question about that? Oh, I was going to move to the next group.
Okay,
So-
I don't know, maybe this, you might cover this, but I'm just thinking if it ties back to your story. You've got these popularizers who are telling a story that is popular. It's easier to hear.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do kind of what we were talking about in the education system where you instill within them this love and this excitement for the subject matter that they just run and do it themselves. They're like, you know what, I don't need you. I can go over here and they just run off on their own and do their own research.
So the challenge so far has been it's overwhelming to get started on your own. It's overwhelming when you find out like how much there is to read. Like you've got all of this, and then you've also got the Making of America, which is this is what goes through the Constitution from the viewpoint of the Founding Fathers. So there's another 800 pages, and then you've also got the 5,000-year leap.
Well, what I mean is like, so no, you're absolutely, I absolutely agree with you on like where in the world you start, right? And
Right.
I get that, but like, how are you guys? And I guess how can we take this information for somebody who is like, where do I start? Well, why don't we just get you excited about the subject matter first, so that they're like, oh, you know what? I'm willing now at this point. At some point, they're finally they I guess they cross the threshold, whatever the phrase might be, to start.
So
being able to do it.
I'll answer that by talking about the rising generation and the restoration generation in just a moment, because those are specifically how we are handling that issue, because it has been an issue. Like we've had this material, the research on the tax exempt foundations, like we've had all this information about secret combinations. We've known about how to restore the Constitution for decades, literally since like the 80s. The reason that it hasn't really gotten out there and taken hold is because there's so much to know and it hasn't been turned into start here, end here, move through at this pace, and it hasn't been a very self-guided experience. So we're building online courses and student clubs and everything. So I'll get into that in just a sec.
Are you guys building like simple, easy to understand videos that kind of teach these concepts?
The thing is, there are people that are very talented with video making that have come to me and have said, give me little short, basically the short summary of what you want a video about, I'll go make it. And we haven't had those short bites of here's the message that needs to be in a video, and it's more work than me and my team can do on our own. So what we're trying to use the rising and restoration generation programs to create a lot of people who can help us work with talented videographers and podcasters and other people, YouTubers, who want to take this message and run with it, but it hasn't been bite-sized enough for them. So far, if someone wants to effectively advocate this message, there has been no summarized place for that, for them, and they have to go through months and months and months and years of training before they feel like they understand it well enough to go make one video. And that's not scalable. That's been our major problem. And so we've found a way that we believe is going to solve that problem. I'll mention real quick the other three things. So you've got the popularizers, you've got the influencers. Influencers are the individuals and organizations that go directly to lawmakers and they lobby. They're the ones that that go and influence media personalities, the people who are the decision makers. Does that make sense? So if you go and influence a decision maker, you are an influencer. And the thing is, there are a lot of people lobbying the legislatures, whether that's state or federal, but there aren't enough popularizers working with the influencers to advocate the same message. When lobbyists are saying one thing and popularizers are saying the other thing, who does the politician listen to? The voter or the lobbyist? I mean, it just gets confusing for the politician about what's expected of them, and even good politicians get dizzy and lost. So we need to make their job easier by having some consistency in the lobbying and the popularizing to the voters.
Well, and that connection is getting stronger. You do see a lot of senators and representatives on these popularizers platforms. They just need to get a little bit more on message, is what you're saying.
On message, yeah. So there's been some congruity between influencers and popularizers on the shotgun approach,
Right.
not the rifle approach. So we're trying to popularize the rifle approach. The third type are the mobilizers. Those are the people that go out to the masses and use emotional appeals to mobilize a lot of people to demand certain types of action. Can you name one organization on the left that is mobilizing people with an emotional appeal?
Oh,
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
And
That is so. Black Lives Matter is a perfect example of a popularizer mobilizer combination. Now, organizations can be both, like two things at a time. You popularize and then mobilize. Sometimes an organization just focuses on one. And then the last one is building. So the builders are the individuals and organizations that build coalitions between organizations that build, that create more inter-organizational unity. They're the ones that fundraise for organizations that are doing a really good job, sometimes for organizations that aren't doing a great job, and that's unfortunate. But the builders are the ones that try to build the capacity of all of the other individuals and organizations in the liberty movement. So our goal is to essentially build a generation of leaders that are trained in the rifle approach, that are capable of influencing, that are capable of popularizing, that are capable of popularizing, and sending them off into other organizations to carry the rifle approach message. And we're getting better and better at shortening the amount of time it takes to train someone in that message before they're prepared to go and advocate.
So I guess we could probably say that we're in the Q&A session by now.
Yeah, go for it.
But I don't want to. Are you done kind of with that topic? I kind of wanted to change
so
gears.
yeah, seminar 3 is filled with all kinds of information. The point of seminar 3 is to say, we know who broke it, we know how they did it, we know specifically what broke that created today's problems, and because we know those things, we know exactly how to reverse it. We don't have to wonder, oh, what are we going to do? It's just a matter of getting enough resources and enough people behind the right message. And that's what Seminar 4 is all about, is how we pull this off.
Where are you guys doing the seminars right now?
During COVID,
I can send you a link of all of
online.
I would love to.
Yeah, we've got them online. What's that?
I can show you. I can show you where you buy them.
Okay.
Yeah, go for
But
it.
my question is kind of more on the content of the rifle approach,
Yeah.
because you and I have had conversations, and I believe from our conversations that the first piece is the 17th Amendment.
Yep.
So could you kind of give us an encapsulation of why the 17th Amendment needs to go, and yeah, really that.
Yeah. Okay. So
What it is and why it needs to go.
Yeah. So the American Constitution provided, through the founders, provided for a really interesting type of legislative body. We believe that a bicameral legislature, which means you've got two different chambers in the legislature, instead of one group of representatives making the laws for the people, you've got two groups of lawmakers that are debating each other and against each other as separate chambers to come to the best solutions. The founders recognized that it needed to be two chambers to accommodate for the two different halves of human nature. The short-term emotionally charged, like focused on today's needs, and then the long-term wisdom that focuses on tomorrow's problems and trying to avoid tomorrow's problems as well as possible. So the House of Representatives was designed to respond to people's emotional demands for right now. The way that they planned to make sure that members of the House, the representatives, cared about the short term was they're only in for 2 years. Now, I learned that the older you get, the faster 2 years goes by, and 2 years becomes not a lot of time to try to impress your constituents. If you get voted in, you don't have a lot of time to pass a lot of bills. There are a lot of people competing for the floor because everyone's trying to impress their constituents by having their bills heard and voted on. And so the representatives go into Congress with this like anxiety, this stress of how can I show my constituents in Arizona, Utah, whatever, that I really care about them, because I want to get voted back in. I need to really satisfy them with the impact that I make right now, and I want to make sure that their problems get heard and that I have a solution for those problems. That's really helpful, but it's also kind of dangerous, right? Because what happens when the people have a very emotionally charged demand, and that member of the House of Representatives goes in and they're trying to advocate for a true desire of the people, but maybe the way they're trying to solve it is dangerous. And it's going to create more problems than it's going to solve. So the Senate was designed to kind of bridle the House of Representatives. Is a horse useful? Is a horse a good thing?
Not if it's not bridled.
Not if it's not bridled, and not if it's angry. If you've got an angry horse on the loose, that's a dangerous thing. So you want to bridle. You want, limits for that horse to be in, and so you need energy, but you also need direction. And if you've got one chamber focusing on energy and making things happen fast, and the other chamber focusing on let's stay focused, let's make sure we're not trying to solve this problem in a way that's going to create more problems. Let's make sure we're keeping our children in mind, because the House of Representatives, people like AOC, they'll spend our children's inheritance. They'll spend away our future and pass a huge debt burden onto our great-great-great-grandchildren if they could, because it's really easy to spend tomorrow's money by going into debt, right? The House of Representatives wants to spend. And they're supposed to, by design, they're supposed to do everything they can to use the federal government to solve the people's problems within its proper role. But because they can get carried away, the founders said we need another chamber to hold them back and make sure it stays constitutional. So the purpose of the Senate was to have representatives of the state governments, the state legislatures, go to Congress and say, you're right, that is a problem. The people are right to be upset about that. We think that this is a problem that needs to be solved by the people, by the states. So we as senators, we promise we're going to take care of this at the state level. We're not going to handle this with the power of the federal government. They're the ones that go in and say, great idea, we should solve this problem, but there's probably a better way to solve it, because your way is going to be really expensive and we don't even know if it's going to work. The way that the founders designed the election process for senators to make sure that this type of an accountability happened was they said senators should be in for 6 years, which means they don't have to worry about getting reelected very often. They just have to do a really good job at becoming experts in the issues and knowing the very best ways to solve each problem, and then fighting against the House when they need to about whether the House is right or wrong about whether or not the federal government's power needs to be used to solve that specific problem. The senators were supposed to be elected by the state legislatures, not by the people, because if you've got the people emotionally voting for members of the House and the Senate, which group is going to be removed from the emotionalism of the people and be able to think straight and not worry about the demands of the people? You don't have that if both are elected by the people. And the 17th Amendment made it so that senators are now elected by the people. That happened during the demand for that started during the populist movement. But the one of the problems that's come from that is senators have to campaign to millions of people, and that's really expensive. They don't have time to meet their constituents. All they really have time to do is go to very, very large groups of people, or to just use the media for their campaigns. Which means it's really hard to check that senator to see if they're all that they say they are, if they walk the walk, or if they just talk the talk. It's really hard to hold senators accountable, especially because we kind of have as a people, we are very short-term focused. Our priorities are in the here and now generally. And so after 6 years go by, we forget all of the terrible things that senators do. The next election comes around, we're like, I mean, life isn't perfect, but like, I don't remember the senator doing anything bad, so sure, I'll vote him back in. And then we have these senators that are in for decades, and then we start to think that the solution is to have term limits, when in reality the solution is just repeal the 17th Amendment.
Which says and does what?
Which is
which makes senators elected by people,
Yeah.
which makes it so that we have 2 houses of representatives and we just call one the Senate.
Yeah. So right now there's no
not the
point.
balance.
There's no point in having 2 chambers both elected by the people.
Right.
Here's one of the dangers. Because you are campaigning to so many people and it's so expensive, you're not going to get to those donations from the people.
Right.
You've got to get those from special interest groups.
And so repealing I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah.
How did the senators used to get in?
By the state legislatures.
The state
Yep.
legislators. And
So-
how can it get back to that? That's what you're talking about.
Just repeal the 17th and it's back.
And
Are
how
there
do we do
people
that?
fighting this
Does
right now?
anybody want to
No
do
one's-
that?
Hardly anyone is talking about
Because
it.
we're
ever.
focused on the shotgun approach.
They're
That's
so
why.
focused
Well,
on the end term limits and balanced budget and more of the band-aid solutions.
Well, but the Democrats would really go against that right now, though,
Unless
because there are so many Republican state senates. And
Right.
so-
However, as I went to Virginia, I was sent to Virginia to do a Missionaries of Freedom pilot program, where we knocked doors and taught lessons on liberty door to door in primarily Democrat areas. And every single time we had a conversation about the 17th Amendment, the way we taught it got those Democrats, very large, primarily black. We hardly found any white people in a lot of these neighborhoods. And these people were like, yeah, so you're saying that the big corporations, this is how they have so much power over our politics, is because they are controlling the Senate? I'm like, yeah, that's why special interest groups have so much control in America, and not the states or the people. We believe that we're in control of the Senate because we vote for them, but we're not holding them accountable. The lobbyists are holding them accountable.
Well, what was that statistic that basically virtually every Senate race is determined by how much money is spent?
Right.
Who
Whoever
spends the most?
spend the most.
So whoever has the most special interest money from corporations
Yeah.
has the power.
Right. And that makes Democrats really angry. I think that Democrats are actually some of the hidden giants for restoring the Constitution once they realize that the corruption that they're so angry at can actually, a lot of it can be knocked out through restoring different parts of the
So if
Constitution.
you repeal the 17th Amendment, what percentage of the principles of the 15% would that involve?
I think that would involve at least 5 or 6 or 7 of the 287. I mean, that's a big chunk.
Yeah.
And the Senate was designed to be the guardians of the Constitution. They were supposed to be the watchdogs of the Constitution to make sure that the emotionalism of the people didn't drive the House of Representatives to blow up the responsibilities of the federal government. So,
When did the 17th Amendment get?
1913, same.
1913 was kind of a brutal year for the Constitution, honestly.
Yeah, so that was the same year as the 16th. That was the same year as the Federal Reserve. The only good thing that I can think of in 1913 was Cleon Skousen was born. But yeah,
Who was the president?
Woodrow
that
Wilson.
was Woodrow Wilson. I think was the beginning of his presidency that year. so he was the one that signed the 16th and 17th Amendments. Or I'm sorry, he was supervising while that happened, but the 16th and 17th were being debated in 1912, and then they got ratified in 1913.
So was it Rockefeller and Carnegie and all those guys?
Oh yeah, they were totally pushing them. In fact, there's a researcher at George Mason University. He is one of the professors of law there. His name's Todd Zwicky, and he is one of the two, as far as I can tell, one of the two leading scholars on the 17th Amendment and the history of why it was passed in the first place. And you can read about his research on Wikipedia. So Todd Zwicky and Jay Bybee. Jay Bybee is, I think he's a judge on the Ninth Circuit, I think is the circuit he's on. He actually is a member of the church, studied at J. Reuben Clark Law School. So those two are experts on the 17th Amendment. If you read the first paper that Todd Zwicky wrote on the 17th Amendment, he says that most people explain the passage of the 17th Amendment one of two ways. Either it was like coming from the demand of the populist movement, where the people just wanted to have more control over
Because it sounded good.
because it sounded good. He says the other explanation that's usually used, is because of internal corruption. And so, for example, there were a couple cases where the state legislature couldn't agree on which senator to put in as a replacement. Let's say a senator dies, or they just can't vote on one from the beginning. Then that state only has one senator, and they're underrepresented in the Senate. And so one of the arguments for passing the 17th Amendment was, we would need the people to vote, because then they'll never get deadlocked, and we'll make sure that state always has two senators and they're fairly represented. Todd Zwicky says, well, first of all, the gridlock argument, the gridlock reason for passing the 17th doesn't really make a lot of sense, because that was a very rare scenario that really didn't happen very often. The cases where it did happen were usually with really new states, where they were still learning how to cooperate with one another and compromise and agree. And so it was a new state problem that they quickly learned from, because when you're underrepresented as a state, you're punishing yourself.
For sure.
And so you have an incentive to shape up, learn how to communicate, figure it out, and represent your state. If I felt like my state was underrepresented in the Senate, federal Senate, because of the inability of my legislators to cooperate with one another, I'd consider that in the next election of the local legislators. So, I mean, there are natural ways of solving the problems that legitimately did exist, but they were relatively minor compared to how history paints those problems. So Todd Zwicky said, I'm not really convinced that either one of these explanations tells the full story, and I'm not convinced that both of them together tells the full story. I haven't finished reading all of his papers, but the conclusion that he's leading to is that there were very powerful special interest groups that used the populist movement and used some of these internal disagreement problems to get the people upset enough to call for a 17th Amendment, when in reality they just wanted the Senate to be accountable to their special interest groups and their power and their wealth, instead of to the states.
What special groups trying to manipulate public opinion?
Yes,
No.
that never happens.
Are you okay?
Oh, I'm feeling great.
Rainbow fire.
I mean, my pinky's a little cold, but I'll just do
You
that
can sit down
sometimes.
on the hearth, it might be a little warmer. Yeah.
Talk just like that.
Yeah, as long as you guys can still hear me all right.
There's one back there, Dad. Oh, thank you.
Well, it's very interesting how we got to where we are.
So, Jacob, do you mind commenting on how the 17th Amendment affected the vertical balance of powers, and what is that?
Yeah, so when we talk about separation of powers, usually we talk about three branches of government. We talk about the horizontal separation between the legislative, executive, and judicial in the federal government. But the most important separation of powers might be the horizontal separation, where we keep power concentrated. Vertical. I'm doing this and saying horizontal. And that comes from a book called Exodus. Exodus 18 is where Moses has freed the children of Israel out of Egypt. So he takes this nation of about 3 million people, leads them out of Egypt, and they are experiencing freedom for the first time in their lives. Can you imagine how many fights you'd have if you're experiencing freedom for the very first time and you've got like all this downtime because you're not building
It was obviously
pyramids and stuff?
problematic. I mean, the golden calf and everything.
Yeah, they're struggling with how to handle that freedom. And so Moses is trying to solve all of these problems with the children of Israel. Jethro comes to visit, and I'm sure that was exciting because, I mean, last time they saw each other, Moses was off to take on Egypt, and he comes back and he's got all these Israelites. So, I mean, obviously he was successful, but they didn't really have. It doesn't seem like they had much time to catch up because there were so many people fighting that they were just constantly coming to Moses with these problems, and he was with the people judging their disputes all day long every day. And so Jethro says, "The thing thou doest is not good for thee. Thou shalt surely wear away thyself and thy people with thee. So take these people and bring families together and have them choose a representative of a group of families. And then those representatives choose a representative to represent their collection of, tens, 50s, 100,000s." And so the idea was only let the biggest problems ever get to Moses, Aaron, and Joshua. Every other problem should be solved as low as possible, as close to the level at which it originated as possible. So that was the goal that the founders had, was solve problems as locally as possible. And that's the place where they can be most equitably adjudicated. That's the location where
They know the circumstances.
they understand.
They have skin in the game.
Yeah, and there's usually some kind of cultural context that may not be understood by judges in other parts of the country. There's just it just gets messy when the further up you try to solve problems, and the one size fits all solution has never proven to be very successful. And so the founders said, we need to separate the power into self-government, families, groups of families, community, county, state, federal. We need to have that separation of powers, and only a very small number of problems ever make it to the federal. They said the only types of problems that should ever be solved by the federal government are problems that cannot possibly be solved by the states. So, for example,
Problems between states.
Problems between citizens and other countries, between businesses, defensive borders. I mean, if you are a state that is in the heartland of the United States, you have a concern over how well the coast is guarded, but you're not there to guard it. Like, it just doesn't make sense for one state to be given responsibility that affects all the others. And so the founders said they made a very specific list of the problems that have to be solved by the federal government. And they learned that not by guessing, but by doing it wrong the first time with the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was their trial and error learning experience. They learned, okay, looks like issues dealing with bankruptcy need to be solved at the federal level, not the state level. We can't have one state having rules for bankruptcy that are different from another state. That needs to be a federal issue. I never would have thought to make it a federal issue, but they learned the hard way that needed to be there. And that's just one example of
A
many.
similar, I mean, it isn't described as completely as that, but it's not. It sort of echoes the government system that Mosiah put in place for the Nephites. You got the lower system of judges and the higher judges and the chief judge. So I mean, the system of government is.
It really is an inspired
Well,
pattern.
I think it was. I think in Rome it was. Is it something like this? Am I making this up? There were senators.
The ancient principles that Sister Openshaw talked about last time. That's all the same thing.
Yeah.
So.
So Cicero understood it, and I know that he got to the top of the I think it was called the Roman consulate. I'm not sure how thoroughly he implemented those principles in Rome.
But the ideas aren't new.
Correct.
The
Correct.
founders didn't invent
Yep.
these ideas.
No, they were just really studied.
Well,
Yep, they understood the history of all of the different nations and what worked and what didn't. So, good questions. A little bit more about the vertical separation of powers.
In the context of the
Yeah, the Senate was specifically designed to filter out all of the attempts to solve problems with the federal government and say, nope, state issue, and just keep suppressing those. And without the state legislatures electing the senators, now the senators don't have a vested interest in protecting states' rights. What they do have an interest in is defending their position, and they're going to stay in office so long as the lobbyists and the special interest groups like them, because that's where they get the money. And the people actually are pushing the senators to solve problems at the federal level. It's now this almost a game where the House and the Senate are fighting over who can spend the most money on behalf of the people and who can solve the most problems for the people using the power of the federal government. And most of the so the constitutional enumeration of powers, that's where we list out the responsibilities that the federal government should have. That enumeration of powers largely hasn't changed. There are a couple things that have changed, like the 16th Amendment said actually we want the federal government to tax the people directly instead of sending the bill to the states. We want the federal government to be able to reach straight into our pockets instead of having to go through multiple levels of representatives who are pushing back against them. For example, the House of Representatives, they were generally the big spenders, but the Senate was incentivized to fight against the big spending, and because they were the ones that, once they approved of the budget, they would have to take that budget to the states and say, all right, California, we've got 10% of the population of the country. We are responsible for 10% of the federal budget. And if the state legislature is now tasked with how do we tax the people to come up with this money, if they're looking at what's in the budget and they turn to the senator and say, why the heck did you put that in the budget? We don't want to, we are the ones that are going to get burned if we tax the people more than they want to be taxed. Your whole job,
Ohio farmers.
Right. So your whole job as our senator was to go in and get rid of this type of ridiculous spending, so that we don't lose our jobs as state representatives in the legislature when we have to tax them.
How plausible is it to get rid of the 17th Amendment? Is that the reality, or is that pie in the sky?
So I think that was going to be repealed by the Liberty Amendment. I think it was in the 80s that the Liberty Amendment lost by one vote. And the Liberty Amendment would have repealed the 16th Amendment and the 17th Amendment and abolished the Federal Reserve all in one.
Oh.
Yeah.
And one vote, huh?
One vote.
And it was in Utah, wasn't it?
I think it was Utah that was the deciding vote on that one.
Well, to recap that, when you hear people, gripe about career politicians or a runaway federal government, and they say, oh, we should fix this with, term limits or this and that, the solution that they don't know that they need that we need to educate them is that we need to repeal the 17th Amendment.
Restore the strength of the Senate.
Yeah.
The problem isn't that the Senate is too strong. The Senate is just unaccountable right now, and has their priorities diverted.
So how do we go about getting back to that?
That's a good
So
question.
okay, so there are several things that we need to fix. Repealing the 17th is one of those. The way to do that is if we can get really good at referring to a problem that's emotionally charged right now. So let's say people are really fed up with
Presidential race.
the presidential race, career politicians, whatever. Like when people are fired up about that, we can say, you're right, that is a problem, and this is the kind of damage that that's doing. This problem is being fueled by the inability of the Senate to hold them accountable or to XYZ. When we understand the proper role of the Senate, we can say, if only we had the strength of the Senate back.
Yeah.
Hint, hint, repeal the 17th Amendment. If we can get really good at referring every problem back to repeal the 17th, and make that popular, then I think we've got a fighting chance. And the good news is, I think that there are hundreds of liberty-minded think tanks across the country that are advocating for the shotgun approach. I think they're teachable. And I think that they would be willing to advocate for repealing the 17th.
Are there any senators or representatives that understand that and are for
Sure,
that?
Mike Lee is. Mike Lee came to our organization, the Thomas Jefferson Center, when he was first running and wanted our help getting elected. And we said, well, what do you think needs to happen to restore the Constitution? And we talked through repealing the 17th, repealing the 16th, repealing the 25th, and all of those others. And he wholeheartedly agreed with it. But the thing is, that's an example of us lobbying a politician, them agreeing that needs to happen, but then if there's not some congruity between what the influencers are doing and what the popularizers are doing, because right now the popularizers are saying term limits, balance the budget, blah, 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 blah. They're saying get rid of Obamacare, all of these things, but the lobbyists are saying, or the good lobbyists are saying, get rid of the 17th Amendment. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to do what gets them reelected, and that's what the people are calling for.
So in the 80s it was off by one vote.
Yeah.
How similar or different are things today? Do we have that kind of favorability still, or is it shifted at all?
So, yes and no. We're in a similar place in that, well, I would say that we're better off in some ways, or worse off in other ways. The way that we're better off is we've never had such a universal. I would say that the conservative, liberty-minded group in America is much more trained, much more educated, much more involved than they were back then. So, in the 80s. Life was relatively comfortable. I mean, we didn't feel a whole lot of oppression from the federal government. We didn't.
25%.
Right. Yeah. And so there was some anger at the Federal Reserve and the
Again, that was a
banking.
good thing to say. Let's get rid of the Federal Reserve.
Yep.
But
Yep.
we can gather better now. I feel like
We can organize a lot
people
better. We
learning
can
through
train
this year,
faster.
this year, I think people are realizing that they can have meetings anywhere around the world. And I
Yeah.
don't think we really grasped that before this year. I think COVID, the blessing of COVID, kind of forced us to realize we can gather with people everywhere. And so it's not, I mean, the possibilities of getting the word out, of messaging people, of anyway,
Yeah.
are so much
The
bigger.
message of how to restore the Constitution, we've developed that. Like we've got great curriculum that says here's what needs to be done. There's no shortage of emotionally charged, energetic patriots. Those are everywhere. The challenge right now is almost calming them down enough so that they're not going to break into civil war before we create an
Right.
educational movement, because ballots are not going to bullets are not going to re-educate
No.
America.
So speaking of the Civil War and the divisiveness, I don't know, but maybe this, and you don't have to ask if you don't want to, but is the what's going to happen with the presidential election in your opinion?
I think life is is going to be relatively the same. I think that there's going to be a really emotional outbreak. There might be some riots. There might be some more buildings burned. We might see a little bit more of what we saw this summer from BLM. And then I think life will...
But do you think Biden's going to hold, or do you think Trump's going to get it reversed?
Um,
I'm just asking for your opinion.
I don't
Depends
think...
on if you watch CNN or something else.
Yeah, so I'm not...
There we go.
I'm not convinced that Trump is going to find enough evidence of widespread voter fraud as soon as he would need to invalidate the election. I think that Biden is going to win. I think that conservatives are going to kind of divide over. Some are going to become very radical and very, very emotionally charged and ready to pull the trigger on anyone that threatens their guns or anything like that, and I don't think that's helpful for creating a widespread educational movement that converts liberals to the side of this is what America should look like. I think that if conservatives really want to win this in the long game, it needs to be an educational movement. And for example, right now, the culture of our politics is you win by outvoting the other side and getting as many Republican or Democrat things done as you possibly can in that window of time while you've got the power, almost as revenge for everything that they've done to you. And then once it's their turn, they get all the political power and they reverse it, and we keep fighting over it. We keep playing tug of war. I watched this video of these two fish in a fish tank. They each had their own little holes that they would come in and out of, and one fish would go into its hole, get a mouthful of dirt, and swim over to the other fish and spit it on the other fish's face. And that other fish was sitting there just waiting for it. He knew it was coming, and the dirt just hit him in the face, and then the other fish would go and just sit in its hole, saying like neener neener, and just like wait. And then the other fish would grab the mouthful of dirt and go spit it on the other one. That's kind of what we're doing. We're expecting a retaliation from the other side. We know it's coming.
Which isn't moving forward.
It's not getting us anywhere. And that's exactly what Marxism wants. Is it wants to divide us, and the secret combinations want us to believe that our fellow Americans are the enemies, not them. We have a common enemy called the Gadianton robbers, and we know who they are. We know which organizations they're working through. The amount of information, the tens of thousands of pages of research that we have on them, you have no question about who's doing it and why, and kind of the mystery of it kind of fades away, and it's just now like, okay, well, we've got work to do. And they want us to think that we are each other's true problems, and they're just. Who's seen Wonder Woman? It's my favorite movie right now. It teaches the entire plan of salvation, in my opinion. But so Ares, he goes in at the end of the movie. He says, "I'm not making people fight. I just go in and I plant a little idea. I give people a little thought, and they fight each other. I just step back and watch."
It's Civil War.
So-
The Marvel Civil
Yep.
War.
I know.
Yep.
Wrapping up here. But I'm just so I think was it Madison who made a statement about the morality of the people is the only sure thing, whatever against the Constitution. It only works for a moral.
No, I think
That was John Adams. John Adams.
said
Yep.
that our
It's
Constitution
wholly inadequate
is,
for any
is
other.
For
wholly
the-
inadequate
Yeah.
for any other but a moral.
Has there
It
been
goes like a
any?
whale through a
I
net.
don't know how you analyze or assess the morality of the people. I think you kind of figure it out based on what they're doing. But in support of that, how would you gauge, or how would your group gauge the morality of the people to even support the Constitution?
Well, the good news is when he's referring to that, that's largely focused on state and local issues, because the federal is more about just defense and international relations. Like, the proper role of the federal has a lot less to do with morality than like the city and county and state levels. So you can have an educated but secular community advocating for the restoration of the Constitution. They might fight against you with what you want to do at the state and local level, but like libertarians and conservatives largely agree, like, well, constitutional conservatives largely agree that restoring the Constitution, pulling that power back down, is a desirable thing, regardless of the differences in moral standards.
So, and then maybe this is just the last question.
Well, I'm happy to stick around.
So,
Inside where it's one.
when you look at like the revelation, and all in the world and all that garbage, right? And then with I guess several of President Nelson's, if you step away from just pure history and you look and say, okay, well, there is some, I think there is some capacity to project and anticipate, I think, based on what the prophets are saying. And I've just heard some people talking about some of the things that President Nelson has said about not going back. We're hearing that in the secular world. We can't go back to where we were in 2019. That's always the question. Nobody asks the question, what in the world do you mean by a statement like that, right? But, we have President Nelson who makes references to the Book of Mormon Chronicles, the nature of this land specifically, and what happened to nations in those particular regards. And I'm not saying that America's doomed, because I don't believe America's doomed. I'm just wondering about possibly a shift of focus. When I read Jacob chapter 5, I read about the Lord had bad fruit in his vineyard. He fully acknowledged it, but he shifted all his focus. He focused all his energy, except in the worst cases, he focused all his energy on cultivating the good fruit, causing that to nourish him. It sounds like you guys are doing that by shifting your focus. Right? And shifting your focus back to the Constitution. We can fight the enemy, quote unquote, all day long, but we're shifting our focus to the Constitution to build that back up. Because as that is built back up by, for example, eliminating the 17th Amendment, we naturally are cultivating the good fruit that's necessary for America to thrive and flourish. So I'm just wondering about, I don't know, in my mind I hear this idea of shifting focus away from the bad things that are happening, all those
and the partisan politics.
Yeah.
I immediately check out once someone starts talking Democrats, Republicans. Like, if I am hearing anyone from AOC to Ted Cruz and everyone in between, the moment they start saying the Democrats, I'm already done listening, or the Republicans, like, I'm done listening. That is such an unproductive.
Dennis Prager,
I think I love Dennis Prager, but
say
he's
that
still
a lot.
focused on the short game. Here's an example of focusing on the short game. Dennis Prager and Prager University are referencing Section 230 of the DMCA, which is about the whole town square versus platform versus private business library thing. Like, they're saying that if you are considered a platform, you're not allowed to censor. So Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, these businesses shouldn't be allowed to censor because they are considered
A platform
a
versus
platform.
a publisher.
Versus a publisher. So the reason that Section 230 of the DMCA was written was to deal with copyright laws. So should a publisher be held legally liable for copyrighted material that's in a book that they published but didn't read? Naturally, you'd say, hopefully not, but they're saying yes, that publishers should be held accountable because they're the ones disseminating
Who's saying
that
this?
copyrighted. Well, Congress passed the DMCA, and so the big argument is what kinds of organizations can and cannot be held accountable for copyrighted material infringements. So that's how this all started. They said that, so Section 230 says, if you don't want to be liable for copyrighted material liability, then you need to be politically neutral. My question is, what the heck does that have to do with anything? Like, why does political neutrality have to do with the lack of liability? They're saying, they're comparing it to town square. They're saying if you want to not be liable you need to be treated like a town square where it's just a community platform. Anyone can go to town square and preach whatever they want to preach. They can perpetuate copyrighted material through their own communication, but I mean, they're not going to be held accountable. Like, town square won't be punished for someone standing in town square disseminating something.
How do you start making differentiation between that and the baker who doesn't want to make a cake that has, you know, 2 people on it that are the
Right,
same
so
size?
that same
Because
logic is treating any large business as a platform
Right.
that needs to be politically neutral.
Or a church pastor who says it's against my personal religious principles to perform
Right.
homosexual
So
marriage.
you were saying that's an example of the short game versus the long game.
Because Prager University has been censored by YouTube and Facebook and Google, and so they're fighting back saying Congress says that platforms should be politically neutral, and so Facebook and YouTube, you're being treated as platforms because you're not legally liable for copyrighted material that's being used, you know, perpetuated on your platforms. So if you're a platform, you can't be politically hostile towards us. So that's the example of a short game. They're operating within today's framework of laws to get the most conservative, fair things happen as possible.
So it's still a good movement.
Sure, if you want to like become really comfortable in a very big government circle, but the amount of money that they're pumping into the lawsuits, defending themselves and fighting against these tech giants, if they used a fraction of that money to popularize repeal the 17th Amendment,
So is there
they
any
could make one
organization
stinking
doing
video.
that? Is there any? I mean, what about the wall builders? Do you know them?
Yep.
Are they working on that? I mean, because
They-
he knows it really.
There are a lot of organizations that agree that it should happen, but here's what I've learned. A lot of organizations agree on a lot of things, and as a nonprofit, generally those are the organizations advocating for stuff like this. As a nonprofit, you only have so many dollars to allocate towards different causes, and they're going to allocate towards the impact that is going to be measurable the soonest, because then they have to go back to their donors and say, look at all of the good we did. So
we rely too much on donors and popularity. Like, I mean,
so
Do we want to move inside?
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's do that.
is that all right?
How do you turn these guys off? Black off?
I mean, we can totally continue the discussion. It's like it's getting cold out here. Let's
As
do it.
everybody walks out, we had a little dog doo-doo accident in the cement. It was cracked onto the cement, don't step into that.